Welcome to the Mindset Game podcast. I'm Verit Kogan, and it is such a treat to introduce you to Dr. Barry Johnson. Barry created the first polarity map and set of principles in 1975. And since then, he's shared his enthusiasm and passion for polarity thinking with a variety of organizations, both large and small, around the world. As chairman of Polarity Partnerships, he continues to explore and promote supplementing or thinking with and thinking to enhance our quality of life on our planet. Barry is both humbled by and proud of the collaborative international community of polarity practitioners, including mastery program graduates who are dedicated to the study and application of polarities in a variety of applications and situations. His seminal book, Polarity Management, Identifying and Managing Unsolvable Problems, captures the foundation of this incredible approach. And Barry's newest publications, and Volume 1, Foundations, and Volume 2, Applications, represent what he and his colleagues have learned about and thinking since his first book. Now, on a personal note, Barry, it is so exciting and special for me to have you here on the show because I am a certified polarity practitioner. And I use polarity thinking and mapping in my own life and with my coaching clients. And it has been tremendously helpful to help overcome personal, professional obstacles, to successfully navigate change. And this is very meaningful to me. Now, I want to say that we've also had another wonderful podcast guest, as you know, Barry. Her name is Kelly Lewis, and she is a graduate of your Polarity Mastery program.
Yeah.
And she spoke about this topic, and I wanted to have you on the show as well because this is, I believe, such an important topic that every single leader in the world can benefit from learning about and, of course, applying, so that we can get even better results and more harmony in our world. So, again, thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, Verit. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. So how about we start with, if you'd be willing to tell us a little bit more, maybe even the story of how you began to explore this whole world of polarities. And then what I'd be grateful for, and we've talked about this, so I know you've prepared for this, is if you can give us kind of an overview of what polarities are, what all this means, and how, again, we can leverage polarities to get even better results.
Okay, I would be glad to. So in terms of the personal history with the phenomenon of interdependent pairs, it actually goes back to when I was in graduate school at Union Theological Seminary in New York City in the 60s. I was there, and I was in an East Harlem internship program, and I went there to try to understand what was happening in the lives of the urban poor. And I ended up living there, my wife and I, for 5 years. And during that time, I got involved in various activities, trying to join with the people in East Harlem and the larger community in making a positive difference. And so we were looking at issues like local control of schools. We were looking at dealing with the civil rights movement. I was actively involved in that. And then organizing around the war in Vietnam. And in this process of community organizing and the like, I was very interested in getting at root causes. And so that got me, after 5 years, my wife, Carol, said to me, she said, now we've been living here for 5 years. We have 2 kids. Normally seminary takes 3 years. How far are you in seminary? And I said, I don't know. I have to check, because I kept dropping out to be involved in one project or another. And I only had a year's worth of credits after 5 years. And so she said, well, maybe your ministry is more about the kinds of things you've been doing these past 5 years than the notion of being a minister of a church after graduating from seminary. And I said, I think that's a good point. So I thought, if I'm going to do this kind of thing, try to make positive change in the world for the rest of my life, then I want to not just protest things that I don't like. I want to understand how we get ourselves into these difficult situations, um, and to try to understand the root causes. And so that set me about trying to understand how we could create organizations that work well for everyone, rather than spend all of our time just protesting when they don't. And so I still protest when I feel called to do so, but I have spent a lot of my life trying to say, how do we build organizations, nation states that work well for everyone? And so that was the quest. And so a part of that quest was to look at myself and my own change. How do I change and develop myself? And in that process, I took a 2-year training program in Gestalt methods at the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland. And it was there that I learned about paradoxical change, that we change most rapidly by starting with where we are rather than by trying to be different. And that paradoxical change was a very fundamental thing. And so after, as I was just completing that 2 years of training in Gestalt, I had a session. I was working as a Gestalt therapist, and I was also running a residential treatment program for heroin addicts. And all of these things were combined to try to say, how do we create organizations that work well for people? And a therapeutic community was a microcosm to figure that out. And I had a session with a woman who's a client I saw for the first time. And in our exploration, we ended up using our 2 chairs. We were sitting on 2 chairs, and we ended up actually creating the first polarity map in that session with her. So it was in one about 50-minute session. And I went home that night and I thought, what we did in that 50 minutes, and how she got unstuck from a change she wanted to make for herself. So it was an individual change process. And how she got unstuck was an exploration of us moving around these 2 chairs. And I thought that would apply to every level of system I could imagine. And so that was the beginning. That was 75. So the first polarity map appeared with a one-on-one situation. So that's the history of it. And we've been learning about it ever since and applying it to anybody who asks. So that's the history for almost be 50 years now in 25. So 48 years ago, I got on this track and have been just learning about it ever since with a lot of folks, including you. So
And
go ahead.
well, I was going to say, first of all, I think it's really cool that you continue to be curious throughout this whole process about what am I really passionate about here. And it's cool that, Carol, your wife, was able to, guide you a little bit there and help you to see what perhaps you couldn't see yet. And that you took the time to expand on this concept and make it something that could help as a framework, as a tool to help many people to get unstuck, because that's exactly what this tool does. So now, for those people who are not yet aware of what polarity thinking is about, can you give us a really good overview of what it means and how we can use it both personally and professionally?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So I've got a few slides that we use often to share that. Let me share my screen.
Please.
And
for those people that are listening just on audio, I know we've talked about this very, that you will have some slides so they can check it out on YouTube. And for those people that are listening on audio, I know, Barry, you're going to talk us through the slides so that we don't actually have to see them to make sense of them, correct?
Yes, I'll do my best to
Thank you.
interpret the slides as well.
Thank you.
So just to reiterate, the Polarity Partnerships mission is that our mission is to enhance our quality of life on the planet by supplementing or thinking with and thinking. And this is a fundamental point. Most of my exploration today is going to be about how to deal with and thinking and how it can benefit us. But I don't want to imply that there's something wrong with or thinking and that and thinking is a replacement. And thinking is not a replacement for or thinking. It is a supplement. As a matter of fact, or thinking and thinking are themselves a polarity. We need to do both. And so that's why we talk about supplementing or thinking rather than replacing it. So, the first thing I'd like to do is just share a little bit about what polarities are. Polarities are interdependent pairs. They need each other over time. In the literature, they're also called paradox, dilemma, or tensions. And they're energy systems in which we live and work. They actually are the two hemispheres of our brain are in fact a polarity, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. So is the front and back of our brain, another polarity, the front and back of the brain. So they're right in us and they're in our life. And there is an energy system involved, which is very powerful. And we articulate two different reasons to bother with polarities. I mean, they're everywhere. Why do we even bother with them? Two of the primary reasons for organizations and leaders to pay attention is that they can help you effectively address resistance to change and incorporate that resistance into the change itself. So if you've got a change you're wanting to make, this as an individual or as an organization or even as a nation state, appreciating where the resistance will come from and where the wisdom is in that resistance so it can be incorporated is part of what a polarity lens helps us do. The second thing is it helps us effectively address polarized conflict. So because polarities, there's a natural tension between the poles of a polarity, they often show up as a polarization. And so polarized conflict is very helpful to position it within a polarity so that we can address it effectively. So the other thing that we do at the beginning of introducing polarities is make a distinction between a problem to solve and a polarity to leverage, both of which are important. So a problem to solve, in most cases, requires or thinking. A polarity, which is a unique set of difficulties, they require and thinking. So a simple example we use is if you were offered to get a job by somebody else. You like the job you've got, but you've got this offer. It's a pretty attractive offer to leave and take on that new job. You've got a decision to make. Am I going to stay or am I going to leave? It's an either or choice. Now, if you decide to stay, then you've solved the problem. Excuse me. You've solved the problem and you can go on with your life. And there's nothing inherent in choosing to stay that you're going to have to incorporate this job offer sometime in the future. So they're not interdependent. They're independent options. You've chosen to stay. So problems can be as complicated as how do we get people to the moon and back safely, or how do we build a computer and a camera and a phone into one wonderful little package. In the process of building these things, there are many problems that we have to solve, and there's a lot of either or choices we need to make. So either or thinking is fundamental and basic to all problem solving. So even though it's essential, when we experience a difficulty, we often then define it as a problem to solve, and we get into an or thinking mindset. Are we going to do this or are we going to do this? But the or thinking mindset doesn't help us when we are dealing with a polarity because there's an interdependence between the two poles. So one of the metaphors that we use is inhaling and exhaling. Now notice it doesn't make sense to have us have a discussion and say, well, are we going to be inhalers or are we going to be exhalers for the future? The reason it doesn't make sense is because inhaling and exhaling are connected as an interdependent pair. They come as a set. It doesn't matter whether we like it or not. They are a polarity, and all polarities come as an interdependent pair. And so we need to connect them with the word and. So we need to, over time, we're going to have to inhale and exhale. So if you have a polarity, it's important to connect the two poles, in this case, inhale and exhale, with the word and. Now, there's another dimension. When I talk about energy between the two poles of a polarity, it shows up as an infinity loop, which, as you know, it looks like a figure eight, if you will, laid on its side. And an infinity loop, what the infinity loop does is it wraps around the two poles. And so as it wraps around them, it cuts between them. And as it wraps around them, when you think of a figure eight, if you've got inhale in one side of the figure eight and exhale on the other side of the figure eight, that the energy of the figure eight crosses between the two of them. You can imagine this in a picture. So inhale and exhale never merge into the same thing, which is true in life. If you think about it, inhaling is great, we need it. Exhaling is great, but if you try to merge the two as the same thing, it doesn't work. You have to intentionally oscillate between inhaling and exhaling. And in that oscillation, along that infinity loop, what happens is there's an upside to both inhaling and exhaling, and there's a downside to inhaling and exhaling, and that makes up the infinity loop. So for example, if we follow the infinity loop to the upside of inhaling, we've got the upside of the left side of this pole now, this figure eight, is the benefit of inhaling is you get oxygen. So that's the upside. And it's great, we absolutely need it. But if you inhale and you hold that inhalation long enough, you follow the infinity loop around the inhale pole, and you go to the bottom of it below inhaling, and you get excess carbon dioxide. So on the inhaling part of the cycle, you get oxygen for the upside, and over time, it cycles around to the bottom of inhaling, and you get excess carbon dioxide. When you experience that carbon dioxide, the natural self-correction to do is to go follow that infinity loop up to the upside of exhaling. So you cross over to the upside of exhaling in order to clear out carbon dioxide. That's the upside. Now, notice how that's the natural self-correction from excess carbon dioxide is to exhale to clear out carbon dioxide. And in one sense, it's a solution, but actually it's not a sustainable solution, because if you hold your exhalation long enough, it circles around to the bottom of exhaling, which is a lack of oxygen. And what happens when you experience the downside of exhaling alone is you now inhale again. It brings you back following the figure eight to the upside of inhaling. So this infinity loop goes from the upside of inhaling to its downside, and then to the upside of exhaling, and then to its downside. And that energy just rotates back and forth around the two of them and holding them together. So what that energy system does, it crosses between them to keep them separate. They never become one thing. So with polarities in problem solving, you can often have compromises, but with a polarity, you don't compromise between the two in the sense of putting the two together and having one result. They stay separate, and they also hang together as a pair. So that's how all polarities work. And it's easy to define one downside as a problem and the other upside as a solution. And so when you experience that carbon dioxide, too much carbon dioxide, you said, I got a problem here. And you can say, let's go to clearing out the carbon dioxide as a solution, which makes sense. However, over time, you will experience the lack of oxygen as a problem. And so you inhale in order to get that solution. So with all polarities, there are essentially two solutions and two problems within that polarity map. So let's take an example of a polarity that all of us experience who are, while we're still involved in a work commitment. So we've got a job to do, we've got work to do, and we also have a life outside of work. So we have this work-home polarity. And what we do in life is we try to make sure that we do a good job at work and that we have a satisfying life with our family, paying attention to our, to our family, to our children, and to our friends, and we have a life outside of work. And so that's one that all of us are dealing with all the time, work and home. Let me go on just quickly to another example of a polarity, which is it shows up with Singapore International Airlines. And so in this case, I'd like you to imagine a polarity map here, which has these two poles with an upside and a downside to each. And when Singapore International Airlines started, they made a decision that they were going to do two things that had traditionally been seen in the industry as a choice that you had to make. Are we going to be a low cost, provide lowest customer cost as a way to gain customers because we're a budget airline, or are we going to be a high-end airline with going after the highest customer satisfaction? So the two poles are lowest customer cost and highest customer satisfaction. And they made the assumption that they could do both. So they were polarity thinkers who didn't know anything about the word polarity necessarily, but their experience and their intuition led them to say, let's pursue both. Let's see if we can be both the lowest, provide the lowest customer cost and provide the highest customer satisfaction. And so the benefits, when you think about this as a polarity map, what we've got here, the upside of providing lowest customer cost is that the customers save money. The upside of highest customer satisfaction is the customers feel exceptional care and service. So those are the two upsides. We want customers to both save money and feel exceptional care and service. Now, if you overfocus on lowest customer cost and you neglect exceptional care, then the customers experience minimal comfort and amenities and services. I'm tolerating the cramped seats and the lack of a lot of amenities like food on the airline or things like that. I'm sacrificing all that because I'm getting the best cost. On the other side, the downside of over-focusing on highest customer satisfaction to the neglect of lowest customer cost is the customers experience maximum prices. So there's that tends to be prohibitive for some people. I'm just not willing to pay that amount of money to get on this airline to commute from one place to another. So we've got this polarity in which they decided we can go after both upsides. We can make sure that customers save money by going to us and that customers feel exceptional care and service. So how do you do that? Well, one of the things they did when they had in this parallel thinking of doing both, they thought, well, any place where the companies will save money where customers are not impacted. So any place that the customer does not experience it, we can figure out how we save money there. So one of the things they decided to do to make sure that customers could save money for the upside of that pole is they put their corporate offices on top of their hangars at the airport. Now think about that. How much money do you save by not having your corporate offices in a downtown where the square footage for office space is just huge? If you put it on top of your hangar, the square footage for which you've already paid for as a hangar. Now, this kind of thinking allows them to save a lot of money, which allows them to do something else for their customers, where customers are able to feel exceptional care and service. So the company spends where customers are directly impacted. So if you were to fly from San Francisco to Japan on Singapore International Airlines on this long flight, what you could do anytime during the flight is walk to the back of the plane to a counter that is set up to serve you a sandwich, a drink if you'd like, whatever you want. You don't have to bring out your credit card. You don't have to say, here's my credit card, this is what I want. You just go, you're a passenger on the plane. By virtue of you being a passenger on the plane, you can get food and drink right there, and it's all there. Notice how what they've done is they have combined saving money and providing excellent customer service, extreme customer service. It is why Singapore International Airlines is annually the lowest cost airline per flight mile amongst all airlines, and it regularly gets the highest customer satisfaction rate of any airline in the world. So what you need to do in order to do both is to assume that you can do both, rather than see them as either we have to be low cost or we have to be high end for customer satisfaction. So those are just a few examples. And what I'd like to do is, oops, I went back here. So I'd like to pause for a second and stop sharing here on my screen. And just see if there's some thoughts you have about what I just shared, Vered, and whether we might build on that conversation. So,
yeah, absolutely. Many, many thoughts. And first, I want to thank you for giving us such a really wonderful summary of the concept and of the difference between the kind of problem to solve or the polarity to leverage or manage. Because as you said, that in and of itself, or polarity is is something that we can look at as an and. So now I loved how you kind of ended with the assumption that Singapore Airlines made around that it would be possible to have an and.
Yes.
And that goes to kind of our belief systems, right? Because if they believe that it's possible and achievable, and of course beneficial both for the company and for its customers, then they can open themselves to finding a way to make it happen, as they did, right? The solutions became visible once the commitment to make it possible was there, right? Once they made a decision and they put resources to figuring that out. And
Yes.
so, how important is that decision to perceive a situation through an and thinking mindset?
It's absolutely fundamental there. And so the point that we're trying to make is that when you experience a difficulty, there's a natural, for everyone on the planet, there's a natural response. I've got a difficulty in service to myself or others. I need to solve it. And where this starts is very, very young. It starts when before we even go to school. It starts when our parents are teaching us the difference between our nose and our eyes. They'll touch our nose and say, "What is that?" Or they'll point to our own nose and say, "What's that?" And the child learns, "Oh, that's your nose, and those are your eyes, and this is a table." So when we teach language, the basics of teaching language is essentially a problem-solving process. What is that? What is its name? Right? Then we get into school and we learn mathematics problems. We learn about physics. We learn about history. Who was the first leader of our country? When was this war take place? All sorts of things we learn in school. And what we're taught in school, understandably so, we are taught that when we experience a difficulty, we should find the correct answer and we should find it as quickly as possible. We need to find the right answer and find it quickly. So whenever we experience a difficulty in school, we have a test and we've got a certain number of questions. We've only got a certain amount of time to get them done. And our desire is to get the right answers and when we're done. So an example of what happens with this is, one example would be multiple choice questions. So for example, I'm kind of walking home with my classmate Jerry Gross, and we're in third grade, let's say, and we're walking home, and we said we had these multiple choice questions about U.S. history, and one of the questions was, who was the first president of the United States? Was it Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, Roosevelt, whatever? And Jerry says to me, I put Jefferson. Now I'm thinking in my head, oh, I think it's Washington, and I think I'm right. So what happens with that is I'm assuming I'm right, and the more I think I'm right, the more I think that he is wrong. So one of the things we learn by this process is that when we're trying to solve problems, not only are we looking for the right answer, we assume when we've got the right answer that those who disagree with us are wrong. Now, all of this comes naturally. It doesn't make us a bad person, but it does set us up for when we have an issue like, so Jerry Gross and I are now, we're executives, we're in the same company. We co-own the company or whatever. And Jerry says to me, I think we need to centralize in order to be more coordinated, system integrated. And I think, wait a minute, Jerry, we need to be decentralized to be more responsive to the customer and flexible. Now the two of us are now in disagreement. It's a different disagreement. But what both of us tend to do is go inside and think, do I think it's true? I would say, do I think it's true that we need to decentralize? And I think absolutely it is. So I assume Jerry needs to be just taught that my truth is the truth, right? Jerry goes into his mind, oh, I've got all these arguments for centralization, and so I think I'm right. So Barry, you must be wrong. And so we're caught fighting over an either or choice in our mind, which is actually a both and possibility. So whenever we experience some tension, some disagreement, the very first thing ideally we would do is step back and say, whoa, there's a tension here. Somebody's in disagreement with me. Might this disagreement be wrapped around a polarity? If so, not only are we both right, we both need each other. So that's a radical differentiation I'm making at the front end. And so the point is that we need to be able to distinguish between problems that are solvable and make a choice, and polarities which are leveraged and recognize it's a false choice. And now we get about saying, okay, how might we maximize the truth that each of us are bringing? How do we maximize centralization, for example, and decentralization? Because that's what we need to do, Jerry, for our company to really be effective. And if we both understand polarities, then we're both willing to consider that it might be, and that we need to, change from fighting over who's going to win this. In the fight, it becomes a vicious cycle between the two, and we get more and more polarized between the two of us. And one of us, we may decide to let go of our company because we think we are so opposite about this that we can't continue, and it becomes a highly dysfunctional process because we've treated a polarity as if it were a problem to solve with an either or choice.
Such a fantastic example. And this concept is true both within each of us as parts of ourself, a part of me this and a part of me that, right? We can look at it through that lens. And it's also, of course, mirrored in our external world, whether it's in our relationships with our spouses and our children, our team members at work, our communities, and our world, where there is a whole lot of disharmony right now, where there's or thinking, and through intergenerational trauma and so on, that those polarities have become so extreme that, from an organizational perspective, it might mean, as you said, disengaging, right? An employee, a partner, right? Disengaging. In our planet, it really is creating aggression and violence and all of those things. And the key here is to realize that the more that we fire and wire, if you will, those circuits around the or thinking, the more that those assumptions become real in our perception, that they become true as what we perceive to be true and real and right, and then it makes the separation even greater, right? Where we're so over attached to one side or the other that we can't see clearly. Our vision is clouded, our perception is clouded. And so what this requires is, of course, learning about this concept as you're teaching us today, so that we can have a framework to make sense out of conflicts or these kinds of situations. And it requires curiosity, Barry. It requires I would say also like a greater faith that there is a solution out there, a belief that there is a better solution that is better for all out there, and grander together, if you will, through unthinking. It also requires curiosity, because I need to lean into my partner, my spouse, and ask the questions. What's important to you about this? What are you perceiving? What is your model of the world? Because without taking the time to really be present with their perspective, not judging it, but being curious about it, maybe even having some, what we would call compassionate latitude, right? Just being open, that then we can begin to see, right, this is what makes sense to him, to her, to them. And that in and of itself just begins to soften some of the extreme significance that we're giving to our side of the equation.
Yes, yeah, I think so, Vered. And the message to the other person from a polarity perspective, the thing to be carrying into the conversation is that I do not have to, if I am in a polarity, if you and I are in a polarity discussion, I do not have to let go of my truth in order to pay attention to the possibility that what you're saying is also true. Because with a polarity, it's not saying it isn't either your truth is true or mine is true. we in this leaning in that you just described, what we're leaning into is the possibility that there's two truths here. And it's much more than saying there's two truths here. What it's saying is these two truths need each other. They're in an energy system that will malfunction if you do not empower both of those poles. So you need to intentionally not only explore, but affirm and empower both poles. In the simple metaphor, for example, of inhaling and exhaling, if inhaling is great and exhaling is great, if we get in a fight over this, what we need to do is not have this compromise in between. We know that we need, if you want to inhale deeply, exhale deeply. So it's actually it's enhancing and empowering both poles that you go after both. So for example, if the polarities around justice and mercy, which some version of which shows up in virtually all of our various religious traditions and philosophies, there's some version of being accountable for our actions, which we absolutely need to do, and of having some dimension of forgiveness, of appreciating that none of us wants to be identified by our worst behavior, by our worst actions. We're more than our worst behavior. The assertion that there's in Desmond Tutu's book, No Future Without Forgiveness. He was talking about post-apartheid South Africa, and the truth and reconciliation process is a great example. It's truth and reconciliation. And if we pursue one without the other, it doesn't serve us well. It doesn't serve the people on either side of that issue. It doesn't serve the community, and it doesn't serve individuals.
And so you brought up the example earlier of centralization and decentralization. And I have to say that this is one that I hear quite a bit, some version of that from my CEO coaching clients. In fact, one of my clients acquired another company about a year ago, and right now they're in the process of integration and making some big decisions around the future of this integrated company. And so we're doing some polarity mapping, and it is really helpful for him and his team. And so if you'd be willing to guide us through an example, I know you've prepared one for us. That's from chapter 5 of the first and book, because I think that this is an important one for any leader to really process and understand, because at some point there's going to be some version of this that they will need to address on a small scale or on a bigger scale. And also for those people that are not leading groups, it could be helpful to further understand how to leverage polarities, how to become very mindful of the early warning signs when we're focused on one side of the polarity to the neglect of the other, and how to create empowering actions to be able to shift, right? To kind of swing the pendulum to the other side, if you will, while minimizing the, cost or potential consequences. So would you be willing to guide us through another example?
Sure. That would be great. So a couple of things to say about that. There's one of the underlying generic polarities, there's a whole section in the book about this, is the part and the whole. So the part could be an individual person in a team, or the part could actually be the team. And if you're the team lead, for example, and you're meeting with others in the department, now your team becomes the part and the department becomes the whole. And you can have the department then becomes a part and the organization becomes a whole. And this can continue to scale up. So the part could now become the organization, and the whole becomes the community in which the organization sits. And the community can be a part of a nation state, for example. Nation state is a part of the world of nations. So this part whole polarity shows up at every level of system, that an individual family member in the family as a whole. We want our kids to have their opinions considered, and we want them to pay attention to what's best for the family. So that so at a very early age, we teach them, yes, your opinion does matter as an individual, as a part of our family. Of course, you're important, and you have unique concerns, unique desires, etc. And it's important that you pay attention to the family as a whole. What's good for our family? So our kids learn this, hopefully, from their parents growing up, and as they grow up, they're willing to both take care of themselves and take care of those beyond themselves. So this part whole polarity showed up in this organization, and it shows up where centralization and decentralization show up, is that decentralization tends to accommodate the needs of the part. Centralization tends to accommodate the needs of the whole. So that's where the part whole polarity shows up with centralized and decentralized. And all organizations that are two or more people have a part whole polarity to deal with. So they have some version of centralization and decentralization to take place. So let me share one that showed up in the book on the screen here. And so I'll just introduce this as a what the situation is first, and then we'll get into the polarity. So I'd like everybody who's listening to this or watching this, I'd like you to imagine that you're on a phone call with a US-based multinational company. The company is located in 46 countries, so it's quite large. It's a Fortune 100 company, and on the call is the chief operating officer, and the chief information officer. No, it's actually that's the chief learning officer, and then the design team leader. And what the design team, the reason the design team leader is there is because the three of them are talking with me. You're on the call as well now, but so they're talking with us about an upcoming gathering of the top 200 and about 20 people in the organization, and the focus for this gathering is a leadership development program. So it's a 4-day leadership program, and they're going to spend a half of the day on polarity thinking. And so this call is in advance, a few months in advance of the program, and they want to let us know who else is being a resource for this, what are the other topics, so that this can be woven in to make sure it fits well with what's happening in the other days of the conference. And the first thing they say on the phone is, Barry, we want you to know what our theme is. Our theme is leading through values. And my response is, well, that's terrific, because from a polarity perspective, values show up as these two upsides, the two poles or the two upsides of a polarity map. And so if we're going to be talking about leading through values, this a polarity map is going to be great because of how values show up in pairs. And the chief operating officer says, well, wait a minute, are you saying that values come in pairs? And I said, yes, so, sir, I think so. So if I'm working with an organization and they're just starting up, it's an entrepreneurial project and they're just starting up, when they identify their mission, vision, and values, when they identify their values, I encourage them to think in terms of pairs. So for example, if they had a list of 4 or 5 values, if they had inhaling as a value, to use a metaphor, I'd look for exhaling as another value, not because I've got anything against inhaling, but because inhaling without exhaling won't be sustainable. It'll undermine the company if they have inhaling without exhaling. And he says, wait a minute, if you're going to be, if you're going to be working with our polarities in front of our top 200 people, you're going to be messing with them. I want to know what you would do with them. And so I'm going to send you my values, our values right now, so we can talk about this. So to tell you how old this was the values were sent to me on a fax machine. And so my fax machine runs and the values show up. Now, one of the values that showed up was autonomous business units. So I'm looking at this value, and what I'm looking for, I'm thinking, okay, I want to help them. What might be an interdependency that they would need to pay attention to about autonomy for the business units. And I immediately am thinking of the part-whole polarity. You want autonomy for your business units, for your parts of the organization. What are you going to do for the whole organization in the part-whole polarity? So I said to them, and I'm looking through their values list, and I said to them, I notice you don't have anything like centralized coordination or integrated business units. You don't have anything about the integration of the company. And he said, yeah, I got your point. He said, so what do you make of that? And I said to him, one of the principles I know about all polarities is if you focus on one pole to the neglect of its interdependent partner, you're going to end up with the downside of the pole on which you overfocus. And since they had autonomous business units as a value, central value, and it makes a lot of sense. If you're located in 46 countries, you need to have some autonomy for all these business units. But they didn't have anything like integrated or centralized as a value. So my hunch was that they were going to over-focus on autonomy and get the downside of autonomy. So I said to them, I'll give you just a few examples, but it was a longer list, but just a few examples to point this out. I said, your organization is experiencing or will experience some silos and isolation of the business units and excess competition. And I didn't stop there. I said, at some point in time, you're going to identify that as a problem. And when you do, you're going to bring your business unit heads together and you're going to agree as to what you're going to do about that as a solution. And from a polarity perspective, what you're doing is shifting to the upside of integrated business units. And so I added the integrated business units in my mind. And so I'm looking at the upside of integrated business units. So they were going to go from silos and isolation of business units to integration of the business units. And instead of excess competition, you're going to go to collaboration and mutual support. I said, and that's what you're going to agree to do. And then you're not going to go there. Now, there is silence on the other end of the line. And I'm waiting for 3 or 4 seconds. And I finally say, hello. And in a very gruff voice, the chief operating officer comes back and says, who have you been talking to? And I said, I haven't been talking with anybody. I just know how values work and how polarities work. And this is pretty predictable. And he said, well, I want to know how you knew we weren't going to walk our talk. Because I held that meeting you described 2 years ago. And we agreed to the person, every business unit head from all 46 countries and my executive team all agreed that we needed to move towards integration of the business units and collaboration and mutual support. And we have hardly moved an inch in 2 years. This is costing us millions of dollars. I want to know how you knew we weren't going to walk our talk. And I said, well, that'll be great. I said, that ought to be the focus of our meeting when we get together. And so it was the focus of the meeting. But let me share from a polarity perspective how I knew that. What I knew was a couple of things. One is they would see silos and isolation of business units and excess competition between the business units as a problem. And they would see the answer as a solution. And they would use gap analysis to respond to it. Gap analysis is a traditional change strategy in which we look at the present state, usually in negative terms, and we identify a preferred future state. And then we talk about bridging the gap between the present state and our preferred future. And all of those elements are important. On a polarity map, they show up as the downside of one pole and the upside of the other pole. And what's missing in a gap analysis is the fact that there's an upside to the pole you're moving from, a historical upside, and there's a downside to the pole you're moving to. And the resistance will come from that dimension of the polarity map. It's a second point of view. It doesn't dismiss the fact that there is a problem and the answer is the upside of the other pole. What it misses is the fact that there's going to be that there's an upside to the pole of autonomous business units, and there's a downside to the pole of integrated business units. So we need to identify what those are in order to see the whole polarity map and the second truth. And so the question becomes, what would be the upside of autonomous business units? Why did they have it as their value list in the first place? And a couple of things would be entrepreneurial initiative. If you're located in 46 countries, you're going to do things different in France than you will in China, than you will in Brazil, right? And so, and you need that entrepreneurial initiative to respond to what the customer needs in that particular circumstance. Also, you want to have speed and responsiveness. You need to be able to do things in your particular location, in your business unit, without having to go to corporate headquarters every time before you do it. So that's why they valued autonomous business units so strongly, that they had it in their value system and they didn't even have anything like centralized or integrated. So once you understand what the upside of autonomous business units is, that historical strength of entrepreneurial initiative and speed and responsiveness, you'll know where the resistance comes from. The resistance will come from a fear of losing that entrepreneurial initiative and speed and responsiveness, which is the downside of focusing on integrated business units to the neglect of autonomous business units. And that shows up as a fear of bureaucracy and red tape and a fear of being slow and unresponsive. So what was happening in this organization, not just individually, but as a whole culture that loved autonomous business units, when they said we want to go from silos to integration, there was an unconscious bias for or thinking and gap analysis in change that led them to an unconscious fear that if they actually did go after the integration and collaboration they said they wanted, they would end up with bureaucracy and red tape and be slow and unresponsive. And it's the unconscious fear of the downside of the pole you're moving towards that was blocking them from getting what they wanted. So what we did when we got together with 200 people, we got them in table groups of 6. We had autonomous business units and integrated business units as a value on a polarity map. And they, by table group, generated what are the upsides of each pole and what are the downsides. And then they identified what are the action steps we can do and are doing and can continue to do, or even new things we can do to make sure we hold on to our entrepreneurial initiative and speed and responsiveness. Then they looked at what are the action steps we can do to enhance our integration and our collaboration. And that got them off from their stuckness and has enhanced them ever since, because the polarity of autonomous business units and integrated business units will be with them as long as the organization is alive. So just to finish up a couple of key points about this notion of the centralized, decentralized, and trying to make a change. Every change effort is part of an infinity loop energy system, and polarity energy is at play. Second, having all the power and all the alignment in a change effort is not enough to overcome the misdiagnosis of treating a polarity as this is a problem to solve in the first place. There weren't any bad actors here. There weren't anybody trying to sabotage the organization. They all agreed where they wanted to go. They were sabotaging themselves by seeing it as a problem with a solution rather than a necessary self-correction in an ongoing polarity, which had to incorporate their historical values for autonomous business units and their fear of bureaucracy. Once that got incorporated and they intentionally could take care of both, they got themselves unstuck. Final 2 points. If you want to guarantee the failure of a change effort, tie it to one pole of a polarity. It doesn't care what the polarity is. You can tie, if your change effort is, I'm going to tie our change to inhaling, it's not sustainable. Over time, you'll discover, oops, that's not enough. I'm going to have to exhale. Also, if you want success in a change effort, tie it to both poles of a polarity. That polarity will always be available to leverage because polarities are indestructible. So let me just stop sharing here and see if there are some thoughts you have, Vered, about that particular story.
Again, many thoughts. And this is actually a fantastic story because, as you said, many of us who are part of any system of 2 or more people, there's some aspect of the part and the whole, right? Sometimes even personally, it could be through the lens of caring for self and caring for others, right? Part of the bigger whole. And that many people struggle with sometimes, to the over attachment of caring for ourselves to the neglect of others, sometimes the opposite, right? We neglect ourselves and then we, get overwhelmed and burnt out and all of those things. So I really appreciated that in kind of the key points at the end, you really highlighted that every single change effort, be it small or large, is part of an infinity loop energy system, and that polarity energy is at play, because what that means when we consider the possibility that is true for our situation is that we need to be patient. We need to recognize that it's just a matter of time, right? Until we navigate, if you will, to the other side. What we want to do is make sure that we, are mindful, that we're conscious of the early warning signs, so that we don't dip into the risks or the negatives, if you will, of that side of the polarity,
Yes.
so that we can maximize and optimize the benefits. And
Yeah.
so the concept or mindset of tying success to both sides is such a, truthfully, a loving approach, because you're going to have people that are on, one side or the other, right, if you will, and in terms of their attachment and their experience and their belief system. And so when we can really respect everybody's perspective here, and let's say if it's a dynamics of consistency, kind of change, staying with the status quo and change, right? Let's say that's the dichotomy we're working with, that we stay the same, or do we change, if you will. If we look at that through the and thinking, then for those people that really don't want to change, right, they're resistant to change, they're very happy with the way things are, or for whatever reason they fear the alternative or the unknown. If we can take the time to really listen to their concerns, to really ask what's important to them, to understand those values that are going to stay consistent, that are going to stay the same, and then meet them there, and then invite them to consider the possibility that that the alternative could be beneficial as well. And over time, again, there is going to be a shifting back and forth. I guess what I'm saying here is that this is a very loving approach. It's a very optimal approach as well, because at the end of the day, it's going to go back. And when it does, you want to make sure that you are conscious of the shift, get ahead of it, so that you're not experiencing what that company experienced, which is where they had the conversation 2 years before and nothing changed, right? People were stuck. And the only way to get unstuck is to have these conversations, to have all the voices acknowledged and heard, and to co-create a plan where we're mindful of the early warning signs, when it's time to shift to the other side, if you will, and we take those consistent actions to get ahead of it, to protect ourselves, to take care of ourselves. So that was a big mouthful. What are your thoughts about all that?
Well, I'm just agreeing with your analysis and summary. And in this case, with this company, it was the culture that was resisting. It wasn't just individuals. It was a culture that loved the fact that they had autonomous business units. This is us. We can do what we want to do in France. They love their autonomy. And so it wasn't just convincing some individuals to do something. It was they all agreed to do something at the head level. But at the gut level, they were, as a culture, unable to move there because unconsciously this could make us bureaucratic, slow, and unresponsive. And so the unconscious bias for or thinking led to the unconscious resistance to the move towards what they said they wanted at the head level, because at the gut level, they weren't going to go. So that gut level desire needed to be affirmed by saying, how are we going to make sure we hold on to our speed and responsiveness? And how do we do that while, having that our system integration? So that became the question, and they needed to be heard by me as a culture. I needed to respect the fact that there's something great about autonomous business units, and they should not let go of it. Encourage them. Definitely, you got to hold on to that. So that and that's what we did at the table groups. When they did the action steps, everybody first did the action steps to support how are they going to hold on to their love of autonomous business units. Then they went to the other pole. So this is very fundamentally important. There's one other thing, another example I'd like to share with you of how companies, this is a company like Singapore International Airlines that had within its own life experience and intuition of the founders that created a clear polarity before I got there. So the situation is that Bina Sharma, a wonderful mastery graduate, had gone to Brazil, and she was working there introducing to a company called Natura Polarity Thinking. And she did such a great job of introducing it to them. They loved it, and they asked if she would invite me to come with her on one of her visits, right? So we were going to Natura together. We get out of the car in front of the from the airport. We get out of the car in front of the corporation. The woman who is in charge of organization development with the company meets me right at the car with one other person, and the two of them walk Bina and me to the front door of their building, and we stop. She pauses, and carved right in the concrete in Portuguese is something that I can't read. And so she stops and she said, "Dr. Johnson, I want to tell you what that says." She says, that says, being well and well-being. And she said, what we mean by being well is that our company is fiscally sound. What we mean by well-being is that we care for our employees, for our community, and for the environment. And so she smiled and she said, "Dr. Johnson, I think we already know something about polarities." And I just love it when this happens, because the wisdom about polarities is ancient wisdom, right? I just did a presentation with 120 managers from China. Everything had to be translated into Chinese. I did it just last week, and they loved it, and they were talking about their tradition, about yin and yang energy, and about polarities are so ubiquitous and so powerful that all of us are aware of them. We all, in a sense, can intuitively say, yeah, that's true. There are places where we need to do this and this. And it's all we're doing with polarity thinking is we're suggesting that a polarity map can be a wisdom organizer as a way to help people get a shared understanding about the phenomena. And it does fit with people's intuition and understanding, which I'm sure you experienced when you first heard about it. It's like, I already know about this at some level, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And so one last kind of quick thought here, since this is a podcast about mindsets, about really how our inner thoughts and emotions, our belief systems, how they shape our perceptions, of course, our behaviors, and ultimately our results. And I love that this framework, this tool is very powerful to make us conscious of our unconscious biases, of our attachments, if you will, whether it's we've been conditioned into them, primed into them, whatever that might be, so that we can become aware of what that means, and open ourselves up to the possibility that there's another perspective, that there is another truth, and that when we can work together to maximize the upside of both sides of a polarity, the sum is greater, the whole is greater than the parts, if you will.
Yes.
And we can leverage that energy to create, to innovate, to break through barriers. And I think that's the key in our organizations. That's the key on our planet in order to create new solutions to all of the discord that's going on in our world. And so with all my heart, I thank you. Seemed like there was another thought there. What just popped up for you?
Yeah. As you were saying that, I was triggered another thought I'd like to share, and that is, it's important to recognize that there is power in the energy system. This is a very powerful energy system. We kill each other every day over polarities. And if you have a polarity, it is necessary to intentionally empower both poles. And there's power in there. If you don't, if you empower one pole and not the other, it will end up harming those with the power as well as those without the power. So, for example, we all have a desire to protect our family and our loved ones. Now, in our desire to protect our family and loved ones, if we look at power as an either-or issue, what we can assume is that I need to make sure I have enough power to prevent my potential enemies from harming me, my family, my loved ones, right? That's an understandable, I need to have enough power to protect. And if I see power from an either-or perspective, the notion is, are we going to have enough power to protect ourselves from them or not? And so the notion is, I'm going to make sure that we have that power. So I see power as I'm going to claim power, and that ends up claiming power without sharing power becomes an abuse of power. And that abuse of power will lead to reactive abuse of power. And so what's needed in places, in nation states and in organizations and in one-on-one relationships is it is absolutely fine to claim power. And it is important to claim power with the intent to share power. Because if we don't, it will become an abuse of power. And it doesn't make one a bad person, but it does lead to very disastrous results. And so that claiming power and sharing power is a fundamental one that is the lack of seeing it as something you can do. We can both claim power and share power. The lack of seeing that leads to regularly an abuse of power, and reactive counter abuse of power happens. And each of us can self-righteously point to the other as the one who's abusing power, and we're both right.
I hope this reaches the ears of every decision maker, influencer, leader in our world. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Barry, from all my heart. How can people learn even more about leveraging polarities, your certification trainings, and of course, all of the work that you and your team members do around the world?
Yeah, our website is just www.polaritypartnerships.com. Go there, and that's from there you can go wherever you want. But yeah, and you can also contact me directly if you want to. It's Barry@polaritypartnerships.com is my website. So I mean my personal email. So that's fine as well. Be glad to talk with anybody.
Thank you once again, Barry. Really appreciate your time, your wisdom, and all the gifts that you've given to us today.
Thank you for the invitation and for this opportunity. I loved having this chance with you. Thank you.